The auctioneer laughed when she laid $3 silver on the table, because he believed she had bought the one thing in Bannack that no living person wanted. He was a heavy man named Pelletier, with a watch chain across his belly, and a way of speaking to the crowd rather than to the bidder, and when Clara set her 3 coins on the plank table, he picked them up and turned them in his fingers and held them out toward the men on the boardwalk so they could see the size of the joke. He told them the lady had bought herself a tomb and that he hoped she had a strong back, because the county would not be hauling her purchase anywhere, and the men laughed the easy laugh of people watching someone else make a mistake. One of them called out to ask whether she meant to live in it. Another said she would freeze in it come January and save the town a funeral. The Icehouse stood at the cold end of Grasshopper Creek in the Montana Territory in the autumn of 1886, a squat building of double-walled timber packed with sawdust, its iron door rusted shut and chained, its roof gone green with moss. The men gathered on the boardwalk said the price was generous, that she had paid $3 for a tomb. They did not know that the woman counting her coins had spent 4 winters learning to read ice the way other people read print, and they did not know what her hands would find behind that frozen door. She did not tell them. She took her receipt from Pelletier, folded it once along a crease, slid it into the breast of her coat, and turned toward the creek without a word. And the silence she left behind her was to those who could read it the first thing about Clara Tate that did not fit the joke. Her name was Clara Tate, and she had arrived in Bannack 11 days earlier with a carpet bag, a leather satchel of tools, and $40 sewn into the hem of her coat. She had not come of her own choosing. Her stepbrother had read their father's will aloud in the parlor of the only house she had ever known, in the Bitterroot Valley, standing by the cold hearth with the paper held at arm's length and his voice flat as a man reading a feed bill. The will had given the farm and the stock and the standing timber to him, and to Clara it had given a clock and the contents of the spring house. She had stood very still while he read it. When he finished, he folded the paper the way men fold a thing that has settled a question, and he did not look at her, and his wife in the corner did not look at her either, and the clock on the mantel went on ticking into the quiet as if it had already become the whole of her inheritance. She had taken the clock down from the mantel that same hour. She had left the spring house, with its crocks of soft butter and its shelf of going soft apples, because she understood it had been named in the will as an insult and not a gift. And she had walked out of that valley before dark with the understanding that a woman alone, judged useless by the men who held the paper, was expected to disappear quietly into service, or into marriage, or into the ground. Clara had no intention of disappearing. What she had, instead, was a trade, and the trade had been taught to her by a man the valley had also dismissed. His name had been Soren Vance, and he had cut ice on the lakes north of the valley for 30 years before his lungs gave out the winter Clara turned 26. He had been her father's hired man, a lean, quiet figure who came each December with his saws and his tongs and worked the frozen lake while the valley slept. And when her father stopped speaking to her after her mother died, it was Soren who had taught her how a frozen thing keeps its secrets. He had let her follow him onto the ice when she was a girl, and he had not sent her home. He had shown her that ice is never simply ice, that it carries the record of the water it came from, the dust that fell on it, the air that was trapped the night it formed. He had taught her to score a block clean with a single pass, so the saw would not wander, to read the grain so the steel would not bind and throw her, to know by the color and the sound whether a stored cache had held its cold or gone soft and treacherous through a warm spell. He had taught her that the cleanest ice rang one way under the chisel, and the rotten ice another, and that a person who listened could hear the difference in the dark. The valley had called him a laborer and paid him by the day, and forgot him between winters. Clara had called him the only man who ever taught her anything worth keeping. Soren had died with little to leave. He had given Clara his ice saw, a long single-handed blade of Sheffield steel with a worn applewood grip that had taken the shape of a hand across 30 winters, and his tongs, and a chisel ground so fine it would part a seam no wider than a hair. He had given her one more thing, the last week of his life, when the fever had him and his voice came thin and he could no longer hold the saw he had handed down. He had told her that the coldest places hold the truest things, and that when the world threw a thing away, it was usually because the world had not troubled to look inside it. She had held his hand and thought it the wandering of a sick man, and she had filed the words away without weighing them. Only later, kneeling in meltwater with a thief's confession steady on a warm stone, would she understand him fully. She would come to understand him at the cold end of Grasshopper Creek. The Icehouse had belonged to the Bannock Provision and Storage Company, a concern that had supplied the mining camp with stored meat and ice through the boom years, and had folded when the gold thinned and the people drifted south. The building had sat sealed for years. The territory had seized it for unpaid assessment, and the county had put it to auction with a clutch of other dead properties. And no one had bid, because everyone in Bannock knew that an icehouse left shut through a decade of summers held nothing but rot and stink and the ruin of whatever had been stored when the door last closed. Clara had walked the perimeter twice before the auction. She had laid her palm flat against the north wall and held it there a long while. She had pressed her ear to the timber. And she had decided, on evidence the laughing men could not have read, that the building was still cold inside. That was the thing none of them understood. A properly built icehouse, double-walled and packed with sawdust, sunk half into the cold bank of a creek and shaded by the ridge, can hold its winter through a great many summers if the door stays shut and the seal stays true. Clara had felt the cold breathing faintly through the north wall where the chink had cracked. She had smelled no rot. Rot needs warmth, and there had been no warmth in that building for a long time. Whatever lay behind the iron door had been kept. The question that had made her lay down $3 she could ill afford was a simple one, and it would not leave her. What had the provision company sealed inside before it ran? And why had it gone to the trouble of chaining a door on a building it was abandoning? She found her answer slowly, the way the trade had taught her to find everything, with her hands and her patience and her refusal to be hurried. The chain was the first labor. It had rusted into a single welded mast where the links crossed, 3 wraps of heavy iron drawn through a staple and locked, and the padlock had long since seized into a lump that no key could have turned. Clara did not have a key and did not want one. She set a cold chisel against the shackle where the metal was thinnest and worked it with a 4-pound hammer through the better part of an afternoon, turning the chisel a quarter after each strike to keep the edge from resting her arm when it began to shake, wetting the cut with a little oil to keep it cool. The sound of iron on iron rang flat off the timber and out along the empty street. Twice she stopped to file a fresh edge on the chisel. Once she sat in the cold grass and ate a heel of bread and looked at the work and did not hurry it. When the shackle finally parted, it did so all at once, with a sound like a struck bell that carried up the empty street, and the chain fell away in a heap. A boy, watching from the boardwalk 100 yards off, turned and ran to tell his mother that the ice woman had broken into her tomb. Clara coiled the dead chain, set it aside against the wall where she could find it, and turned to the door. The door fought her longer. Iron set in a timber frame and left through a decade of freeze and thaw had bound itself to its hinges with rust the color of dried blood, and a careless person would have set a bar to it and sprung the frame and brought the lintel down. She did not force it. Forcing a thing was Soren's first prohibition, the rule he had repeated, more than any other, that a thing made to move will move if you find how it wants to, and a thing broken stays broken. She worked penetrating oil into the hinge pins with a feather, a little at a time, across 2 days, letting it travel down into the rust overnight. She tapped each pin upward a hair with a punch and a light hammer, listening to the change in the sound as the pin began to free. She wedged the gap she made with thin shims of dry pine, driving them a finger's width at a time so the door's own weight would not bind it again. On the third day, when the door gave at last, it came open not with a crash, but with a long, exhausted groan that ran the height of the frame, and out of the dark gap rolled a breath of air so cold it fogged in the autumn afternoon, and raised the hair on her arms and made her, for one moment. The men had told her she had bought a tomb. The cold that rolled out told her she had bought something that was still alive, in the only way a sealed cold can be alive. It had kept. Whatever was inside, it had kept. She did not go in that first day. The trade had taught her that, too. A long-sealed cold space opens suddenly, will sweat and shift, and a body that hurries into it can bring the whole stored season down in slumped ruin. She propped the door its width and let the building breathe against the milder air through the night, and she sat outside it with her back against the timber and her coat drawn close, and she listened to the small ticking, settling sounds of a cold giving up its stillness by degrees. In the morning she lit a lantern, took up Soren's saw and his chisel and his tongs, and went inside. The interior was a single long chamber, the floor a foot deep in old sawdust gone gray, and rising out of the sawdust in ranked rows were the ice blocks, hundreds of them, each one a yard on its long side, stacked with the care of men who had known their work. The lantern light went into them and came back blue. Clara stood in the doorway a long moment and understood that she was looking at a stored harvest a decade old, ice cut from some clean source in the last winter the company had worked, packed and sealed and then abandoned when the gold gave out. It was by the measure of the laughing men, worthless ice was not worth hauling out of Bannock to anywhere that would pay for it. Clara, though, had not bought it to sell as ice. She had bought it because Soren had taught her that ice keeps a record, and she meant to read what this ice had kept. She began at the front and worked back, and she worked the way he had taught her, reading before cutting. She held the lantern close to the faces of the blocks and looked into them. Most held only what clean lake ice holds, a few strings of trapped air, a faint banding where the freeze had paused and resumed. 4 rows back, in the heart of the stack where the cold ran deepest, the blocks changed. They were not clean. Suspended in them, held as a fly is held in amber, were things that did not belong in a block of stored ice. In the first such block she found a leather pouch frozen flat against the upper face, the kind a man carries coin or papers in, its surface darkened and its drawstring fused into a single stiff knot of frost. Quote. In the second she found a folded square of oilcloth, sealed at its edges with a wax that had gone the color of old honey. And in the third, when she had chipped the frost from its surface with the flat of her thumbnail, and brought the lantern near and looked into the clouded blue heart of it, she found a face. She set the lantern down very carefully on the sawdust and sat back on her heels in the cold and made herself breathe. Her breath went out white. The lantern flame stood straight in the still air. Somewhere in the timber overhead, a settling block ticked and ticked again and was quiet. It was not a body. She understood that within the first hard minute, when reason came back to her and her heart slowed, and she made herself lean in and look properly instead of recoiling. It was a photograph, a tintype on its thin iron plate, sealed into the ice with its face turned outward, the image of a man with a heavy mustache and a banker's high collar, his expression composed and certain in the way of men who have paid to be photographed. Beneath it, frozen in the same block, a hand's breadth lower, lay a second oilcloth packet bound with waxed cord. Someone had not stored these things by accident. Someone had cut a channel into a curing block with a warm blade, laid these things into it in their order, and let the next hard freeze take them and close over them, hiding them in the one place no thief would think to dig and no fire could reach and no decade of summer would betray, so long as the door stayed shut. Someone had used the ice the way Clara's whole trade said ice could be used. As a vault. As a thing that keeps. Here the chronicle must slow the way Clara slowed, because what she did next she did across many days and with great care, and the care is the heart of it. A thief had trusted ice to forget, and ice forgets nothing. Consider, before we go on, how many things the world seals away and calls worthless, how many freight cars and steamboats and shut-up buildings are passed by every day, by people certain there is nothing inside worth the trouble of looking, and how seldom anyone is taught the patience to look anyway. Clara had been taught that was her whole inheritance, the one thing the will could not give to her stepbrother, and the one thing her stepbrother would never have wanted, and it was about to prove larger than the farm she had been denied. She did not know yet how large. She knew only that she had 4 blocks to thaw, and that she would thaw them properly or not at all, and that the man in the tintype had a name she had read on a slip of paper dried between 2 warm stones. To free a thing frozen into ice without destroying it is the most delicate work the trade knows. Clara could not chip at the blocks directly, for the chisel that frees a seam will shatter a tintype or tear a sodden paper to pulp. She built, instead, a slow thaw. She carried the marked blocks one at a time on a stone-boat sled, a low wooden drag she hitched to her own shoulders and hauled. Out to a shaded lean-to she built against the north wall from salvaged planks where the sun would never strike them, and the air stayed cool and even. There she set each block on a rack of slats above a shallow trough, and she let the milder air take the ice away, an inch at a time, hour by hour, catching the meltwater in the trough so that whatever the ice released would settle gently down into clean cloth she had laid below to receive it. It was slow, past the patience of any ordinary person. A single block took 2 days to give up its center, and she could not leave it, for a thaw left alone overnight will run too fast at the last and drop its burden into the trough with force enough to ruin it. She slept beside the trough, wrapped in 2 blankets, waking to feel the blocks with the back of her hand and to ladle the meltwater away. She turned each block as it narrowed so it would not topple. She did not let the thaw outrun her, not once. Across the whole long labor, the leather pouch came free, first easing out of the softening ice on the second night, so gently that it settled into the cloth without a sound. Inside it, sodden but whole, were 11 double eagles, gold coins of $20 each, heavy and cold in her palm, and a slip of paper gone soft as wet cloth on which a hand had written a column of figures and a name. Clara dried the paper with the care it demanded. Laying it between 2 flat stones, she had warmed at her cook fire and turned until they held only a gentle heat, the way Soren had dried his tally sheets when a wet season soaked them, and when the ink steadied and stopped its running she read it. The name at the head of the column was Halloran. The figures below it were sums, large ones, and besides several of them, in a different and smaller hand, were the words paid in full, and beside others the single word held. She did not yet know what the column meant. She set it under a stone where it would stay flat, and she went back to the ice. The oilcloth packets came next, 3 of them across 4 days, and they were the marrow of the thing. They held documents, kept dry by the cloth and kept whole by the cold, and Clara spread them on the warmed stones and read them through 2 lantern-lit nights, and what she read rearranged the ground under the town. The papers were the private ledger and the correspondence of the Bannock Provision and Storage Company, and the Provision Company had been a smaller, plainer name for the business of a man named Emmett Halloran, who had also held the only bank in Bannock through the boom years, and who had also held the paper on a great many of the small claims and homesteads that ringed the camp. The ledger told a patient, ugly story, told in the clean columns of a man who believed his cruelty was only arithmetic. Halloran had lent against claims at the height of the boom. When the gold thinned and the claims could not pay, the law gave him the right to foreclose, and foreclose he did, and there was nothing in that the law forbade. The ledger, though, held a second set of figures beside the first, and the second set did not match the first, and the difference between them was theft. Halloran had recorded payments in his private book. That did not appear in the book he showed the court. Men who had paid him in coin and in gold dust weighed on his own scale had been entered as having paid nothing, and had been turned off their land for debts they had in fact discharged, and the land had gone to Halloran, and Halloran had sold it onward. The honest book and the court book stood side by side in the oilcloth, and the gap between them was a row of families put out into the cold on the strength of a lie written in a ledger. There was a letter as well in Halloran's own hand to a partner in Helena, and in it Halloran wrote plainly that the camp was finished, that he meant to be gone before the spring assessment, and that he had taken steps to see that the proofs of his accounting would not fall into hostile hands. He did not write where he had put them. Clara, though, kneeling in the meltwater with the letter steady on the warm stone, understood where he had put them, because she was holding them and because she knew the one fact about Emmett Halloran that the letter let slip without meaning to. He had owned the Icehouse, he had owned the cold. And a man who wishes to hide a thing past all finding, and who happens to own a building packed with curing ice, and who is clever and cold by nature, might think of doing what no one else in the territory would think to look for. He had buried his sins in the ice, and chained the door and ridden out, certain that the one place no one would ever dig was a tomb of frozen water in a dying town. He had reckoned without a woman who could read ice. He had reckoned without Soren Vance dead in the Bitterroot whose hands lived on in his pupil. What Halloran had sealed away as the safest hiding place in the world had become, the moment Clara laid $3 on the auctioneer's table, the most dangerous thing he had ever done. She told no one at first. A woman alone, holding papers that named a powerful man a thief, has to think hard about how the truth will be received. And Clara thought hard. She knew that if she carried the ledger to the county seat and laid it before whatever clerk would see her, the papers might vanish. Or she might. And the men who had laughed at her, $3, would shake their heads and say the ice woman had gone strange in her tomb. Soren had taught her never to force a thing. She did not force this. She began, instead, to find the people whose names the honest ledger held. The first was an old man named Asa Buckner, who kept a few goats on a stony patch east of the creek, and who had once held a good claim on the gulch above the camp. Clara found him mending a fence in the thin autumn light, driving a staple into a leaning post with short, careful blows of a hammer worn smooth at the head, and she did not announce herself with the papers. She asked him plainly whether he had ever done business with the provision company, and the old man's hammer stopped in the air, and his face closed like a door pulled to against a draft. He told her he had paid Emmett Halloran every dollar he owed in dust he had weighed with his own eyes on a scale he trusted, and that Halloran had turned him off his claim anyway on a paper that said he had paid nothing, and that he had spent 11 years knowing he had been robbed and knowing there was not one thing on earth he could do about it. Because the robber kept the only book, and the book said he was a liar. He said it the way a man says a thing he has stopped expecting anyone to believe, looking not at Clara but at the fence post, as if the telling were a habit he kept up only for himself. Clara took the honest ledger out of her satchel, unwrapped it from the dry flannel. She carried it in, opened it to the page that held his name, and turned it so he could read it. The old man set his hammer down in the dead grass. He took the book in both hands the way another man might take something hot. She watched him read his own name and the sum beside it, and the words that should have been there and were, in this book, paid in full. She watched 11 years move across his face, slow as weather. He did not weep. He put one cracked finger on the line and held it there, pressing as if the page might be taken from him before he was done, and after a long time he said, in a voice that had gone unsteady at its edges, that he had begun to think he had dreamed the whole of his honest life. Clara told him he had not dreamed it. She told him it was written down in the man's own hand. In the book the man had hidden in the ice. That was the first restitution, and it was not made of money. It was made of a name set right. There were others. Across the close of that autumn and into the first hard weeks of winter, Clara went quietly from one stony homestead to the next, to the people whose names the honest book held, and she showed each of them the line that bore their name and the truth of what they had paid. A widow named Effie Dunmore, who had lost the cabin her husband built and had taken in washing to keep her children fed in a rented room above the livery, came to the door with her sleeves pushed up and her hands red from the tub. And when Clara turned the book to her and showed her the line, she read it standing in the cold doorway with the steam still rising off her arms. The line proved her husband had died a landowner and not a debtor. She read it twice. She pressed her hand flat to the page the way Buckner had, and she said very quietly that she had told her children their father was a careful man, and that she had begun to be afraid she had told them a lie. Clara told her she had told them the truth. A blacksmith named Tom Reyes, dark-handed and slow to trust, would not look at the book at first, telling Clara from across his cold forge that he had no use for old paper and old griefs, and that she should take both somewhere else. She set the book open on his anvil and waited. He read his own name without meaning to, the way the eye reads a thing put in front of it, and then he read it again, and then he sat down heavily on the anvil and was quiet a long while. And when he spoke, he asked her only where the book had been all these years. She told him. He shook his head slowly at the strangeness of it, that the proof of his honest life had lain frozen in a building he had walked past 1,000 times. One by one the people the town had watched fall and had judged for falling learned that they had not fallen at all. They had been pushed, and the proof of the pushing had been frozen in a tomb $3 bought. The old man Buckner became Clara's ally in the work, and his standing in the camp, which was the standing of a man everyone knew to be honest even when they had believed him beaten, gave her the credibility a young woman alone could not yet claim. It was Buckner who knew which families remained and which had drifted. Buckner who hitched his old mule to carry Clara and the precious papers along the frozen tracks. Buckner who sat by the door of each cabin while Clara showed the ledger, so that no one could later say the ice woman had come alone with a story. The labor of restoration, like the labor of the ice, went one careful piece at a time. What of Halloran? The men on the boardwalk would want to know. What became of the thief? The answer is the quiet kind this story is made of, and it will not satisfy anyone who wants a thief dragged into the street. Clara never confronted Emmett Halloran. She never rode to Helena to fling his ledger in his face. She had no need to, and Soren had taught her that the truest work makes the least noise. What she did was simpler and harder to undo. She had the honest ledger and the court ledger copied, line for line, figure for figure, by the one lawyer in the county seat she judged honest, a tired man named Pruitt, who kept a narrow office above a harness shop, and who read both books through twice before he said anything at all. When he had finished the second reading, he took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose for a long while, and then he asked her carefully where she had come by them, and she told him the plain truth, the Icehouse and the $3 and the channel cut into the curing block, and he listened without once interrupting. When she was done, he said that in 30 years of law he had never been handed a thing so complete and so damning that a confession in a man's own hand was rare, and a confession a man had hidden so well that he could never disown it without hanging himself was rarer still. He had the copies made by his own hand, so that no clerk could be bribed to lose them. He had the copies entered with the territorial court, alongside the recorded deeds of the foreclosed claims, so that the gap between the two books became a matter of public record that no single official could make vanish. And he let the thing move at the speed of law and paper, which is slow, but which once it is moving is very hard to stop. Halloran in Helena was by then a man of standing, an investor in a smelter and a holder of town lots, a man who had buried his Bannack years under a decade of respectability. He learned that his old ledgers had surfaced from a source he could not explain because he alone knew where he had hidden them, and he could not say so without confessing what they were. He could not denounce the woman who had found them without naming the Icehouse, and he could not name the Icehouse without explaining why a banker had chained his sins into a tomb of ice. The very cleverness of his hiding place had become the lock on his own mouth. We are permitted once and briefly to see into him. In the single moment the law's letter reached him at his fine desk in Helena, and what was in him was not remorse. It was the cold understanding that the safest thing he had ever done had been the most foolish, that he had trusted Ice to keep his secret, and Ice had kept it too well, kept it whole and perfect, and waiting for the one pair of hands in the territory that could read it. His standing did not survive the record. He was not hanged. He was not shot. He was, across the slow grinding of 2 years of suits, brought by the families whose claims the record restored, simply unmade, his respectability dissolved, like a block left in the sun, until the name Halloran meant in Helena what it had meant all along in Bannack, and he took himself and what money the courts left him somewhere west, and was not heard of again. He became in the end exactly what he had tried to make of the people he robbed. A man erased from the ledger. A man the record did not hold. The claims came back slowly. Not all of them, and not whole, for a decade is long and some of the land had passed through too many hands to recover. Asa Buckner, though, got his Gulch claim back, and Effie Dunmore got the deed to her husband's cabin restored to her name, and the children she had raised in a rented room grew up on the land their father had cleared. Tom Reyes, the blacksmith, got a judgment that let him buy back his shop. The 11 double eagles Clara had found in the leather pouch she did not keep. She gave them to Pruitt to hold against the costs of the suits, so that the families would not have to choose between their claims and their bread, and when the suits were done and a few coins remained, she had them divided among the children of the dead, the ones whose fathers had not lived to see their names set right. Clara Tate kept the Icehouse. It was when all the rest had been carried out and read and entered and restored, the only property she had ever owned outright, $3 worth of double-walled timber at the cold end of Grasshopper Creek, and she found she did not want to be rid of it. She mended its roof and chinked its walls and packed it fresh the next winter with clean ice cut from the creek above the camp, scoring each block with a single clean pass, the way Soren had taught her, and she went into the trade for herself, selling stored coal to the few who remained and to the ranches spreading out across the benchland where the mining camp had failed. The men who had laughed on the boardwalk did not, on the whole, apologize, for men of that kind rarely do. They stopped laughing, though. One or two, in the way of such things, came to buy ice from her in the heat of summer and stood a little awkwardly at her door, and she sold to them at the same price she sold to everyone, and that was as near to an apology as the matter ever came. And it was enough. She had not done the work to be told she had been right. She had done it because it was the work, and because a man she had loved had taught her that the coldest places hold the truest things. She was an old woman, decades on, when she told the last of it to a granddaughter who had asked why the icehouse at the end of the creek mattered so, when it was only a shed full of cold. By then the territory had become a state and the camp was a ghost of itself, and the families whose names she had carried from cabin to cabin in a hard winter were 2 and 3 generations on, scattered across the bench and the valley, most of them never knowing that the land under their houses had been given back to them by a woman. Clara did not mind that they did not know. The work had not been done to be remembered. She told the granddaughter the plain shape of it, the $3, and the laughing men in the cold that rolled out of the open door, and the face frozen in the blue heart of a block 4 rows back, and the slow thaw, and the honest book that had freed the names the false book had buried. And when the girl asked what had become of the saw, the long Sheffield blade with the worn applewood grip, Clara rose, though it cost her something to rise now, and took it down from its pegs above the door where it had hung for 50 years, and put it in the girl's hands. and closed the girl's fingers around the worn grip the way her own fingers had been closed around it once, in a valley she had been cast out of with nothing, by a man who had known that an inheritance is not the land a will gives you, but the thing your hands are taught to do. The ice house still stands at the cold end of Grasshopper Creek. The door is mended now, and it opens easily, and the chain that once sealed it is long gone for scrap. The cold inside it is the same cold, though, kept the same way, by the same patience, and on the hottest day of a Montana summer, a person who steps through that door still feels it roll out to meet them. The old kept cold, faithful as it ever was, holding whatever it is given. What would you have done if you had been the one to lay $3 on that table and break that frozen door, knowing what the cold had kept? If a story of patience outlasting cruelty is the kind you care to sit with, there is another waiting, of a woman and a thing the world threw away, that you may want to hear next.